I'm your host for today. Before we start, just a few quick safety reminders as we do. Make sure you're joining this webcast from a safe location. If you have a headset on, like myself, make sure you can hear the fire alarm, you know where the nearest emergency exits are, and please don't take part in this webcast while driving. Now, today's roundtable is part of a series by the CEO Action Network, or CAN for short, in conjunction with Climate Governance Malaysia. CAN is a coalition of 45 leading businesses representing more than 20 priority sectors in Malaysia. Its purpose is to shape policies, win stakeholders, and create a favorable ecosystem for sustainable businesses and sustainable development in Malaysia. Now, Climate Governance Malaysia, on the other hand, is the country chapter of the Climate Governance Initiative started by the World Economic Forum. Allow me here to also take a moment to extend our gratitude to Microsoft, who are our technology partners for this roundtable, very kindly hosting us on the Microsoft Teams platform today. Thank you very much. A reminder to all audience members that if you have any questions that you would like to ask at any point to any of the esteemed speakers, you can key those into the chat function on the side. Now, with that, I would like to invite Young Bahagia Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, Policy and Advocacy Lead of CAN, as well as founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, to deliver her opening remarks. Over to you, Datin Sri.
Thank you so much, Chern. A very warm welcome to our esteemed speakers today and all our distinguished participants. Thank you for joining us for our fourth roundtable session on the energy and transport sector, where today we will discuss the very important topic, is Malaysia ready for carbon pricing and green financing? My name is Sunita and I'm the chairman of Climate Governance Malaysia and a member of the steering committee of the CEO Action Network. As Chern has already described, Climate Governance Malaysia is the Malaysian chapter of the World Economic Forum's Climate Governance Initiative. We were founded in May 2019 and we comprise non-executive directors from leading enterprises in Malaysia. The CEO Action Network is a network of CEOs representing 47 leading companies across 20 priority sectors in Malaysia working to address sustainability. Why are we doing this? Because businesses are the leading emitters of greenhouse gases around the world, and this series of roundtable engagements with key ministries in government and civil society is the private sector trying to play our part. And specifically, this initiative is led by directors and CEOs. Collectively, our focus is on making sure that companies play their part in increased climate and sustainability ambitions. Companies can make a huge difference in the fight against the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. We all have a common goal in moving our industry forward on climate action, but to be really effective in moving the needle, we need clear and predictable government policy. We understand that to align behaviors, we need to align numbers, and nothing aligns mindsets as quickly as putting a price on something, especially if it's universally recognized as a pollutant. So CAN and CGM are organizing this series of roundtables for this time across 4 key sectors, which is energy and transport, property and construction, plantations, and the telecommunications sector, which is coming up. In today's session, we hope to get feedback and ideas on measures which can help us significantly lower our national carbon footprint and get us on the road to net zero. Out of these roundtable sessions, CAN and CGM will prepare a report to the government suggesting how we could collectively contribute towards more ambitious mitigation and adaptation efforts in light of the climate emergency. This report is timed to be submitted to the government in the run-up to November's COP26 conference in Glasgow. More generally, we all want to play our part in building a whole of society and all of government engagement between key stakeholders in Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, CAN and CGM are really honored to have you with us today. In addition, we are very appreciative to have the support of the Chairman of Bursa Malaysia, Yang Berbahagia Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar. We're very grateful to our esteemed speakers today. Moderator Encik Nik Shahrizal, partner at PwC Malaysia, will introduce them to you. And finally, we owe a debt of gratitude to the hardworking and committed team from Petronas, Tenaga, PwC, and Shell for organizing this and the other roundtables in this series. We could not have done this without you. I'm confident that with the excellent panelists we have with us today and with your input, the audience, we will have a rich exchange of ideas. Thank you so much, and back to you, Chern.
Thank you very much, Datin Sri. Now, before we get into today's agenda, we've got a keynote and what promises to be an exciting roundtable discussion for you. We would like to check in with all of you first via a few poll questions, which is, I think, the norm these days on these virtual platforms. So we have three poll questions for you today, which we're going to ask you twice. So we're going to ask you the first set now, and the same questions again at the end of today's session, just to measure if we manage to change any opinions or sway any of you. So the poll questions should be coming up on your screen now, I hope. The first one is, can Malaysia reach net zero emissions by 2050? And you have four options there. Yes, no, too ambitious. Three, not quick enough. Four, I don't know. The second question is, does carbon pricing have a role to play in reaching net zero emissions? And the third one is the same one, but does green financing have a role to play in reaching net zero emissions? So we'll give all of you maybe about 10 seconds to get your answers in, and then we'll take a quick look at them before moving to the keynote for today. Okay, so we've got some answers coming up. Okay, I think we're all quite we're probably starting from a quite a good place with this slice of audience members. Let's see if these shift positively or negatively after today's discussion. Thank you everyone for your responses. Now I'd like to move on to the keynote, and I invite Yang Bahagia Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar, Chairman of Bursa Malaysia, to deliver today's keynote address. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Yang berbahagia Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, distinguished speakers and panelists, Tuan Syed Ahmad, Ms. Tan Miling, Mr. Julian Tisera, Mr. Darshan Joshi, Encik Nick Sharizal, and participants, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking the CEO Action Network, Climate Governance Malaysia, and in particular Datin Sri and Encik Ahmad Hadri for inviting me to deliver today's keynote on whether Malaysia is ready for carbon pricing and green financing. In doing so, please allow me to share the big picture first before zooming in on carbon pricing and green financing. Ever since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, the issue of climate change has become increasingly pressing. The agreement, which was signed by almost every country on the planet, aimed to limit the average rise in global temperature by the year 2100 to within 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Over the past few years, increasing public awareness and the weight of scientific evidence on changing weather patterns have contributed to the mainstreaming of this topic. And more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has added to the urgency of this debate by demonstrating how a global crisis can jeopardize our way of life. As a result, more parties are now taking the necessary steps to assess the implications of climate change. Climate change, much like COVID-19, knows no borders and poses an existential threat to all of us. While COVID-19 and climate change may appear to be unrelated, they share many characteristics. For instance, both crises are causing significant disruptions to the global economy, undermining society's resilience and well-being, particularly in terms of loss of lives and livelihood. Climate change, if not addressed properly, will be similarly disastrous to that of COVID-19 aftermath. According to the recent UN Climate Change Report, nations must redouble their efforts if they are to meet the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global temperatures rise to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And similarly, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change has stated that emissions must be reduced by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 in order to be on track to reach net zero target. In line with these global transitions, Malaysia must focus on demonstrating strong climate change leadership as well as charting innovative paths towards a net zero economy. Much of Malaysia's climate action is currently guided by pledges made to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is to achieve a 45% reduction in the emissions intensity of GDP by 2030 relative to 2005 levels. However, it is critical that Malaysia shifts its focus to total emissions reductions rather than emissions intensity of GDP, given the targets are relatively easy to meet, as long as economic growth exceeds emissions growth. Against this backdrop, the need to decarbonize the economy remains as pressing as ever, not only to avoid potentially irreversible consequences of a humanitarian and planetary crisis, but also because there is a strong economic and business case for doing so. Being an early adopter in the zero carbon space will allow both our country and businesses to capitalize on economic opportunities and gain a competitive advantage from the global transition that's already underway, such as discovering new export markets and increasing productivity. Ladies and gentlemen, achieving a net zero future will necessitate a national approach and commitments from all stakeholders. There are also numerous challenges that must be addressed if we are to raise our national climate ambitions. For instance, uncertainty about where to start and how to build a business case, a lack of data and reporting, the complexities of navigating climate scenarios, and a lack of buy-in from stakeholders are just some of the challenges that businesses face when embarking on a decarbonization journey. However, these should not be used as justifications for businesses to avoid taking the necessary steps. The risks of doing nothing or doing too little have far-reaching impact to the environment and can have disastrous consequences to our economy. A strong decarbonization pathway, on the other hand, can help to unlock a more prosperous, resilient, and sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, to address climate change and transition to a net zero future, both the public and private sectors must work together. In this regard, I would first like to draw your attention to two key enablers that can support the transition towards a low carbon ambition, of which the government can ramp up on. They are carbon pricing and green financing. Carbon pricing is widely recognized as the most efficient and cost-effective way to reduce emissions and encourage investment in cleaner solutions. It is essentially capturing what is known as a negative externality, the unpriced external cost of emitting that would otherwise be borne by the public in other ways, such as healthcare costs incurred or loss of property as a result of severe weather conditions. Carbon pricing is gaining traction and prices are expected to rise in tandem with rising demand. So it is only a matter of time before they become prohibitively expensive to pay for. Companies must ultimately decide whether they want to reduce their emissions or continue polluting and pay for their carbon emissions. On the green financing side, Negara's climate change and principle-based taxonomy serves as an important framework for increasing the flow of financing towards green or low carbon activities. And more recently, the Joint Committee on Climate Change, or GC3, has also expressed its interest to improve financial institutions' ability to manage climate-related risks. As climate considerations become an important factor in lending and investment activities, they will naturally have a trickle-down effect on the rest of the economic sectors, further driving the transition to a low-carbon economy. However, to support both carbon pricing and green financing, as well as the broader net zero transition, we also require better data sharing. And this is where the government and private sector must work closely together to identify and measure essential emissions data related to business activities. Governments and regulators must invest in more robust emissions disclosure and reporting schemes in order to collect more accurate data. Only with better data will governments be able to consider developing effective carbon pricing schemes, whether through carbon taxes, cap and trade, or other appropriate mechanisms. Aside from data sharing, market-based incentives are essential for encouraging the deployment of promising environmental solutions with high decarbonization potential. Currently, the Malaysian government offers tax breaks for the purchase of green technology equipment and the use of green technology services. Creating economic incentives encourages the mainstreaming of green activities, infrastructure and skills, resulting in greater resource efficiency and a green economy. Ladies and gentlemen, the private sector has the potential to boost the country's climate ambitions. When more businesses see opportunities in the decarbonization economy and begin to act on climate change, it will signal to the government for support of ambitious climate policy. I guess there are three major ways in which businesses can contribute to the climate agenda. The first is through improving climate change management activities and disclosures, which serves as the foundation for an ambitious action. Disclosures assist businesses in staying ahead of regulatory and policy changes and by identifying and addressing emerging risks. In addition, these can help in identifying new opportunities for action that stakeholders require. In October 2015, Bursa Malaysia made ESG reporting mandatory for listed issuers in the main market and East market. In tandem with that, a sustainability reporting guide was issued to help listed issuers in embedding sustainability in their organizations and reporting on it. Secondly, setting future carbon emission targets while considering national and international emission reduction commitments, such as the Paris Agreement. For instance, the adoption of the Science-Based Targets Initiative into carbon emission targets provides companies with a well-defined path to decarbonization through science-based target setting that is in line with the Paris Agreement's goals. Setting big, bold, and ambitious targets with methods like science-based targets is about more than just combating climate change. It is also about the best interests of the companies, as it is likely that this will result directly in operational cost savings while businesses take aggressive steps to reduce emissions by optimizing resources. And further to this, it can unlock an organization's potential for innovation. The long-term nature of science-based targets provides insight into key market trends that can be shaped by the low carbon transition and the necessary transformational actions. This clarity can shift a company's focus towards the development of more innovative solutions and new opportunities. And third, but not least, it's about taking action to reduce emissions. As identified by the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2021, the top 5 global risks in terms of impact are all related to the environment. Businesses must start treating climate change as a real risk and build an agenda for reaching net zero emissions by 2050 into the business strategy. And this is also very much in line with the updated Malaysia Code on Corporate Governance 2021. Companies must ensure that their business models are resilient to climate change and compatible with a net zero economy. This could include, among other things, reorienting towards cleaner energy sources and raw materials, seizing opportunities to deliver marketable climate change solutions, and utilizing nature-based solutions and technologies to offset unavoidable emissions. Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned at the GC3 flagship conference in June 2021, often with any crisis comes the opportunity to reset our world. In this context, to build back better and greener. Much more needs to be done if we are to transition to a climate resilient economy. Market players, regulators, policymakers, and all stakeholders need to work together to develop and deliver a sustainable financial system that works at all levels. Businesses have a unique position in society to be the driving force in the fight against climate change. This is because businesses have the ability to influence the supply chain and influence customer behavior in order to adopt more climate-friendly solutions that aid in the decarbonization of the economy. It may not always be an easy journey ahead, but it can be made easier if we work collectively and constructively. Thank you for your attention and have a productive session ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Abdul Wahid Omar. I think he covered a very wide range of points and topics in his keynote. So with this, I think that sets the scene for a very lively discussion. I would now like to hand over to Mr. Nick Sharizal. He is a partner at PwC to lead today's discussion with our panelists on Is Malaysia ready for carbon pricing and green financing? Over to you, Nick.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for the kind introduction. So firstly, I just want to say good afternoon. Thank you to everyone who's watching this session right now. My name is Nick Sharizal. I'm from PwC. I will be the moderator for this session. So today we have a very important topic to discuss, and the subject of our discussion today is Malaysia ready for carbon pricing and green financing? Very exciting topic. And I'm very proud to have with me today 4 illustrious speakers who will be sharing their point of view on this topic. So let me do a quick introduction on each of them. So for the first speaker, we have Encik Syed Ahmad Syed Mustafa, the Chief Operating Officer of Malaysia Green Technology and Climate Change Centre. So thank you very much, Syed, for joining us today. Second, we have Tan Mei Ling, the Country Operating Officer of World Bank. Thank you, Mei Ling, for joining us today.
Thank you, Nick.
Third, we have Julian Teixeira, the focal point of Malaysia Youth Delegation. So thank you, Julian, for joining us today. And finally, we have Darshan Joshi, analyst from the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. So thank you very much, Darshan, for joining us today. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump straight into this discussion. So I would like to start my first question with Mei Ling. So Mei Ling, my question is this. Many countries have stated their commitment to the Paris Accord, to reduce the carbon emission and reach net zero by 2050. So based on what you have seen around the world, what are the tools that countries use to meet this aspiration? Is carbon pricing one of them?
Thank you very much, Nick, for your question there. Yes. In terms of carbon pricing and also the COP26, the aspirations that we have seen, first of all, last week we have the IPCC report, and also there's also the submission of the updated NDC by Malaysia on 45%, increasing from 35% to 45% unconditional by 2030. Although Tan Sri Wahid mentioned that that can still be more ambitious than that, but at least that has increased up the game. So in terms of that, this COVID-19 pandemic, on one hand, it also has made the fiscal position of the government, of the country very tight. But on the other hand, this COVID is also can be seen as half full. The glass is half full. This pandemic has really given us an opportunity around the world, for countries all over the world that we see and where World Bank works in, to rethink and reset the economy to a greener and a better future, grow greener and better. In this case, this is where Malaysia, not just on the road to COP26, but also the road to Budget 2022. And hopefully this will go in hand, because that's around the same time, October and November period, that it goes into Budget 2022 if we are going to achieve our targets by 2030. So in this sense here, if we look into carbon pricing, it's definitely a suite of one of the set of tools in the entire climate action package. So it's a very economically it's efficient tool that a lot of economists sees that we see in the World Bank that already 45 countries in the world that has applied more than 63 different tools and a blend of different tools of carbon pricing. In East Asia and Pacific alone, there are 7 countries already that has embarked on this journey, and a few more that is already seriously considering, because it takes a few years for the national government and the industry to design, plan, and implement. So 7 countries has already implemented in East Asia Pacific, and that covers China, Korea, Japan, and nearer to Southeast Asia, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. Singapore has already implemented carbon tax and a very holistic climate action package for the country. And also in Indonesia, they already started considering, and the last 2-3 years, in this year, they are piloting. There are 2 carbon pricing mechanisms. One is the emission trading scheme, and the other one is carbon tax. And they're doing it by phases. And this is a smarter way to do, because then you are learning as you're doing. And there are other countries within different jurisdictions in different regions to learn from. So carbon pricing is still a new subject in the last 10 years. But Malaysia definitely, with this urgency of climate change, it definitely should start the road towards 2025, 2030 on carbon pricing, but it's one of the two in the whole package of climate action.
Right. If I can expand on my question a bit, Mei Ling, you explain about carbon pricing and other countries who are adopting who have adopted them. Why is carbon pricing such an important tool towards managing emission? We have a lot of policies, we have a lot of awareness session, but what is the unique value proposition about carbon pricing?
Carbon pricing is seen as one of the most economically efficient climate policy option. And what it means is really it shifts the burden, the responsibility to a polluter pay principle. So it putting a price on carbon pollution, and it's a means to bring down emissions and to drive investment into cleaner options. So it's where bringing the government and the private sector to play their part. So it's an economic signal to the private sector and polluters to decide whether they're going to discontinue this polluting activity, reducing the emissions, or continue polluting and pay for it. So that is a strong signal to the market players. So the 2 most widely used systems that we've seen implemented to date is the emissions trading system. And what this ETS system is that for every plant, every facility in the sector, for every facility, it tracks the level of emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions, and it puts a cap. This is the cap. All right, and so you might actually be having this level of intensity, and it puts a cap. So it then incentivizes the facility then to maintain within that cap or have a lower amount. That lower amount, they can sell that, they can trade that, so they can easily get a revenue from that. So it's a market-based performance principle. And then for companies that have yet to actually bring that down, they have to buy. They actually have to buy that. So there's a trading mechanism. A carbon tax, as you know, then tax on the level of carbon dioxide, etc., of the greenhouse gases that's being emitted, and that's being taxed to whoever that's emitting it and consuming it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your explanation. So based on what you say, it sounds to me that there is a very distinct element of operationalization there. It's not just about setting the direction. It's all about pricing the carbon and basically, putting a cost towards pollution. So I'm going to move my next question to Encik Syed. Syed, you work in MGTC, one of the key agencies in this country towards, managing and reducing greenhouse emission. I read in the website that, Malaysia has committed to reduce our greenhouse emission by 45% by 2030. So following what Mei Ling mentioned earlier, what is your view on carbon pricing? Is this an important component towards us as a country reducing the emission or not? Sorry, Encik Syed, I think you're muted. I just unmute a bit. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry for that.
Great. Yep, okay. Got it.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, I just would like to echo what Bailey had just mentioned just now, because in the case of Malaysia, in our transition to a low carbon economy, of course, I'm totally in the opinion of carbon pricing that can be one of the best solution to consider. This is in view of the fact that firstly, it mitigates emissions by motivating the adoption of low carbon means of production by the industry players, and at the same time, it will encourage more investments for the deployment of low carbon technologies. And as a result, also, it will sort of deter on the increase in demand for high emitting products and services. So I'm looking at carbon pricing also on the perspective of funds that are available, because in terms of carbon tax, if you look at carbon tax, this revenue that's derived from carbon tax could also be used to build up public finance through creation of funds that can finance low carbon projects to drive further climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. And at the same time, importantly, is that it can use to establish the R&D funds to promote development of innovative low carbon technologies. So of course, in our transition into the low carbon economy, leading to perhaps a carbon neutral future by 2050. So the big question today is who is going to pay for it? Yes, of course, like Mei Ling has mentioned, polluters have to pay. So as we are aware, government budgets are very limited and are channeled to other priorities, and especially in this unprecedented times of the COVID-19 outbreak. So one of the ways, apart from the carbon tax revenue that we can use, the other way is that we can also tap funds from the private sector. And we know the private sector has huge funds, and we can leverage these private sector funds as another consideration to finance all these low carbon technology projects. So in fact, I just would like to share what we have been doing, our work on facilitating green financing, is that perhaps most of you are already aware that we had administered the Green Technology Financing Scheme, which started way back in 2010 up to 2017. And basically, it's a loan guarantee scheme introduced by the government to stimulate the growth of green technology adoption. And the scheme, which came into being in 2010, it was designed to tap private sector funds from the banks and financial institutions to finance green businesses. And it offered a government guarantee of 60% of the loans provided by the banks, and as well as to mitigate the high financing costs due to the high risks perceived by the banking sector during that time. A rebate was given to the borrower of a rate of 2% per annum on the interest rate that had been charged by the banks. So the scheme has been successful in providing easy access for bank financing by green project developers and green product producers, which otherwise is a big challenge during those days. So, the scheme has ended in 2017, but the government had this year introduced the GTFS 3.0, which has a slightly different approach. It's more focused on the issuance of green bonds and SRI Sukuk, but still loan financing can still be eligible for the scheme. So GTFS 3.0 is now managed by Dana Jamin. It's a 2-year period for 2 years with the limit allocation of 2 billion ringgit.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So it sounds like there've been a lot of initiative towards reducing the emission. My next question goes to Darshan Joshi. So Darshan, you work in the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. I understand you wrote an article recently titled "How the Country Should Tweak Our Policy Ahead of COP26 to Reduce Emission." So my question to you is, if we look at the current initiatives that we have right now in this country, and if you try to compare that to what ideally it should be, towards reducing our carbon emission, do you think that the initiatives we had right now is sufficient, or or are there more that can be done?
So from my perspective, and carbon pricing is a topic that I've been looking into for quite a while now, the big missing piece in our climate policies is carbon pricing. And if it's okay with you, I'll just go through a few reasons why this is the case. So the first key rationale for carbon pricing is simply, like been mentioned before, it speeds up the pace of the transition to a cleaner, greener economy. Mitigating climate change is so straightforward on paper. What we have to do is cut emissions. And we've tried many things for many years in Malaysia. We've tried many policies to boost the adoption of renewables. We've tried to promote the use of energy efficient vehicles. We've invested a lot in public transport. We've tried policies in the waste and agriculture sectors. We've tried a lot of almost fragmented command and control approaches to achieving environmental wins across these disparate areas to mitigate our contributions to climate change. But even then, our total emissions continue to rise. Even under our most ambitious climate scenarios, we are projecting a 40, maybe 50% increase in our total emissions, which in the context of climate change is the most important thing that we need to cut. And on the other hand, we have carbon pricing, which, as opposed to the specifically targeted command and control policies, it's an all-encompassing sort of policy. So we're saying that here's the true cost of the use of fossil fuels, of using this dirty technology. You either pay up or you switch to a cleaner alternative. And with carbon pricing, we might find that cleaner alternatives are already economically viable, depending on the price of carbon. So from a policy perspective, carbon pricing sort of keeps things simple. We price carbon and let markets take over from there. It's the most free market approach to carbon policy there is. And in doing this, we speed up the transition, like I mentioned, to a lower emissions pathway by leveling the playing field for low carbon technologies relative to the high carbon incumbents. We can support the growth of these low carbon industries, have opportunities to move up value chains in these industries, and support other things like wage growth, for example. So the growth of the clean tech industries and the associated industries becomes something we try to maximize in the process of shifting to a low emissions pathway. My second point is more of a almost geopolitical perspective where it's getting a bit interesting these days. So just last month, the EU announced that they'll be implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and which will apply to a specific set of industries, some of which will affect Malaysia as an export-oriented nation. But I'm less concerned what this means at this point specifically, what this variant of the carbon border adjustment mechanism means, than what it signals. Because bear in mind that every country that has a domestic price on carbon has an implicit incentive to tax the carbon content of their imports. There are two reasons for this. The first is that they want to level the playing field for their local manufacturers who will compete against foreign companies, say, who don't have a carbon price. So this is one way to protect them. The second is to disincentivize or remove the opportunity for arbitrage that exists for, let's say, EU companies to shift production overseas and avoid paying a price on carbon. So every country that has adopted a price on carbon, and we're seeing more and more countries do this, have an implicit incentive to impose carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The thing about carbon border adjustment mechanisms is that they have been around in theory for a long time. They just haven't been implemented because they're geopolitically very, very contentious. And that's what makes the EU's move very compelling, because it could open the floodgates. Indeed, after the EU made their announcement, John Kerry said that the US was also looking into something like this. So the more countries who adopt carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the question for us then becomes, why don't we impose our own price on carbon? Because every dollar or euro or ringgit that's collected by a foreign government based on the carbon content of products produced in Malaysia is a dollar or ringgit foregone in revenue for us. So this creates an incentive for us to impose carbon pricing domestically. And this way we sidestep the issue of exports being subject to border adjustment mechanisms when we enter foreign markets. For a very open, trade-oriented and export-oriented nation like Malaysia, navigating these sort of climate-related headwinds that will increasingly affect international trade is imperative, and carbon pricing is critical in this regard. Thanks.
Right. Thank you very much, Darshan. Okay, so my next question goes to Julian. So Julian, you have a lot of interaction, with the youth in this country. So for the last 10 minutes, we've been talking about carbon pricing, how to reduce the carbon emission. So my question to you is, from the perspective of the Malaysian youth, are these issues something which is very important to your circle or network?
Thank you, Nick, for the questions, and thank you to the other panelists for the insights that have been shared. So firstly, yes, among youth, we are concerned about climate change. And in particular, there are studies that have shown that Malaysian youth think that climate change are increasingly concerned about climate change, think that action should be taken, and so on and so forth. And so because there's concern about climate change, then there's also discussions and discourse about sort of what can be done about climate change. And certainly at NYD, we are in favor of like evidence-based policies, and there is a good economic consensus that carbon pricing is an effective and efficient policy tool as part of a toolkit of solutions towards addressing climate change, and so in that sense, we would be in favor of like an effective and efficient policy. However, we would also want such policies, including, for example, such a carbon price, if it were introduced in Malaysia, to take into consideration as well the potential consequences of on end users like youth, and also how, for example, the revenue from this carbon price will be utilized, will it be reinvested in society, will it be distributed fairly across society, and also at this point in time. Given that the last few years, as research, for example, from the World Bank has shown that income has, especially among younger workers, has been stagnating. If, let's say, Malaysia were to introduce a carbon price, if that would translate into higher costs of goods and services, how would that impact young people? And what other policies would then the government take to help support like income growth among youth workers? So. Yes, for carbon pricing. However, it should be part of a more comprehensive toolkit.
Thank you very much, Julian. That is an excellent point, which, I'm going to take that point and ask you, Mei Ling, in terms of what is the impact to the industry and the economy, based on what we have seen where carbon pricing has been applied before. And if I'm allowed to ask two sub questions, what is generally the impact to the companies and industry? Because whenever we talk about carbon pricing, about tax, it is a function of cost. In what way does it shape the economy? And number two, just like what Julian mentioned earlier, how would it impact the end user? Does it mean that some prices or cost is going to go up?
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for your questions. All very good and not easy questions. Let me try to take it one by one. In terms of the private sector, let me take it first, private sector, and end that with consumers. For private sector now, for businesses across all sectors, being green and being sustainable is almost a requisite. It's not a nice to have, a nice to do. If any company is part of the global value chain or export oriented or any part of the global value chain, it's almost a requisite right now, whether you're exporting to Europe, to UK, to US, in many other countries, that you are being green and sustainable, right? So it is a need to be part of the DNA. So and putting a price on carbon, I think we also need to have a very practical approach, and in terms of where we see where it has worked and worked better, lessons learned, is then have a carrot and stick approach. Have the carrots first. and then the stick later. And what the carrots are, you can have tax incentives, you can have grants, you can have advocacy and market building awareness measures to the marketplace. And these carrots, right, it's really, for example, if you have reduction in your energy cost. Every company wants to reduce cost, especially now. And if you have a reduction in your energy savings, you get an incentive. Right. So it's not just about putting, you need to have a precondition of putting in green investments, right? But the moment you save energy, maybe you have an incentive in there. And also it can be a source of revenue in terms of RE, renewable energy. And you can see recently also by Energy Commission that if then the solar fits into the grid, then it's also a source of revenue. So you decrease your cost by energy savings, you increase your revenue by having solar panels on your buildings and your factories, and you get a source of revenue, and it's competitive. Right, you need, especially if you're part of the global value chain or even in the local economy. I think the marketplace right now, the consumers, whether it's the young, the youth, or you're a 95-year-old, right? A 95-year-old, so David Attenborough to Greta Thunberg, right? You're a father, you're a mother, you're a son, you're a daughter, and you're a consumer. You want a greener world. And this is where you can also exert demand on the local economy for those companies who are not export-oriented. So that's one. In terms of taxing carbon pricing, yes, definitely. There might be pass-on cost. If that carbon tax is not offsetted enough. But this is where the role of the government comes in, because the government can then use fiscal measures to then say that if we having carbon tax or even removing fossil fuel subsidies, right? And we've seen that in countries, for example, in Indonesia, they remove, there's a phased approach in removal of fossil fuel subsidies, and that savings goes into more and better targeted cash handouts to the B40. Right. So we know that subsidies all around the world, there are many surveys and studies that says blanket subsidies do not benefit the poor. Actually, it benefits the reverse, the top 40, right? So in terms of oil, fossil fuels, will it benefit those who own cars or own motorbikes? It will be those who own cars, who consume more electricity, those with 5 air conditions at home. So I think this is where we really need to really have an honest look and say, is it really taxing the poor? No, it's not. In fact, it's detrimental.
Right. Thank you very much, Mei Ling. So from what I'm hearing from what you just said is that that there need to be a cohesive and coordinated management towards carbon pricing. It's not something that we should sort of execute in isolation, because you talk about, how some community might be affected, and then you need to sort of supplement that with, with fiscal policies. So what I'm hearing is a coordinated approach is needed. So my next question goes to you, Syed. So, as a government agency, if we agree that carbon pricing is one of the important tools that we need to have towards reducing our carbon emission, from the policy perspective, what do you think our country should do, or what are the infrastructure or framework that should be put in place to make this happen in a coordinated approach?
Okay, well, as you know, the carbon pricing issue is widely debated, and it also has these political challenges, whereby, like what's mentioned, contradicting policies, subsidies of fossil fuels, which will hinder the uptake of the low carbon technology, and there are also exploits by the political opponents, and what was mentioned also on the pricing. Of course, we perceive that this kind of policies will be unpopular, because they need to manage the perception of price increase, and of course the policymaker would have to, well, most of them would like to just ignore what is the rest. But for Malaysia, I think the environment for this to work, it must be conducive. Firstly, I'm looking at the enabler, which is the financing side. If you say about carbon tax is detrimental to the lower income bracket, yes, but we can have policies that provide rebates, offset some of these prices increase and for the country. So there are mechanisms, there are tools that we can use to offset those, and then we can subsidize the lower income bracket in terms of rebates. And as far as financing is concerned, what I'm saying is that if we would depend on the government budget, government public finance to finance our transition to a low carbon economy, we won't have enough. So we need another source of funding, which is come from the revenue from carbon tax. And the other part also from what I mentioned before, is on the private sector. So these two makes a lot of impact in our move towards a low carbon economy. And we look at, if I want just to share what we did on leveraging on private sector funds, the GTFS scheme, which I mentioned before, when it ended in 2017, because GTFS was the only incentive, only scheme that is supporting or facilitating green financing. So when we ended in 2017, we had successfully financed 431 green projects with a bank loans of about 5.5 billion ringgit. That projects that have obtained financing and reaching the full limit of the scheme, in fact. And as a result, the expected greenhouse gas emission reduction was about 5 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year, and energy conservation of 36,000 plus megawatts per year. And we had contributed to the generation of renewable energy of more than 600 megawatts, with the avoidance of waste going to the landfill of 2,000 tons per year. So we need more such instruments, de-risking instruments or credit enhancement instruments such as the GTFS or any other instruments in order to spur the development of the green of the low carbon economy. So I'm certain that there are mechanisms that we can, or tools that we can impose on how to mitigate the perception of rising prices, and how whether it doesn't go to only to the benefits the rich, and how we can also assist the poor by having all these subsidies, and at the same time we can use whatever tabung, the revenue coming from the tax, that we can enhance the our effort into the low carbon economy.
Thank you very much. Okay, my next question is to you, Darshan. There have been some point of view that, I mean, if you look at the structure of our GDP, we are still, oil and gas is still a big part of our, economy. And there is a point of view that because the concept of carbon pricing, is focused on the carbon intensity of the industry, then naturally oil and gas will be one of those which, would be affected by it. Now, considering that, our oil and gas industry is one of the biggest revenue generator in the country, it employs thousands or hundreds of thousands of people across the industry. Do you think that, having a carbon pricing policy would be beneficial towards our economy overall?
Yeah, so there's no denying the fact that this is part of the reason why it's very politically contentious. And when we do embark on a carbon pricing policy, we need to make sure that any potentially regressive effects that are siloed in specific sectors are put in place to take account of that. It's important to realize that when we're pricing carbon, we're not saying that we need to eliminate the use of fossil fuels immediately. Carbon pricing is all about balancing between carbon-driven economic growth, which has given a lot of benefits throughout history, and carbon-driven environmental degradation. It's about achieving that balance. So when we impose a price on carbon, especially if we transition into a carbon pricing regime that sees the price of carbon gradually rise over time, we are not going to see very dramatic, painful effects within even the high carbon sectors. You mentioned oil and gas being one of the sectors that will be affected, and that's true. But what carbon pricing will also do is it will make oil and gas more competitive against technologies like coal, which still supply about 65% of our energy needs. So in a way, we'll still be we won't be severely damaging the oil and gas industry to the extent that it might be.
Right, thank you very much. Okay, so let's shift our conversation. We've spoken at length about carbon pricing. Let's talk about green financing a bit, because Syed, as you mentioned, that green financing is also one of the most important elements towards this objective. So my question to you, Julian, is, from the perspective of our youth and our young generation, what does it take to create more awareness about green financing? Or maybe let me just hit you with another question. Is our young generation, are they excited about green financing? How do we make it more popular?
Hi, thank you, Nick, for the questions. I think for the first part of the question about what does it take to create awareness of green financing, I think the first step before getting to green financing would actually be to helping Malaysian youth develop their financial literacy, because I think, well, there is some evidence that financial literacy to some degree is a bit lacking among Malaysian youth. That's why we struggle with things like high credit card debt and so on, living beyond our means and so on and so forth, and unwise management of personal finances. So I think the basic thing, first step would be first helping Malaysian youth get a grasp of personal finance, understand how finance works, and then the next step will be to then understand like green finance and also the opportunities that it can create. For example, like you could there would be potentially new investment instruments that could be accessible to use. For example, green bonds that might be used to also fund projects then that will have like direct net benefits for youth, like through investments in research and development that create then new green jobs that could be targeted at young workers. And in terms of awareness of green finance, our impression in MYD is that it's still limited. Partly is because it can be quite a complex and technical subject, and if the basic knowledge among Malaysian youth about general personal finance is already limited, then what more like a more technical subject like green finance?
Thank you. So Mei Ling, taking from what Julian has mentioned right now, from your point of view, how do we improve the take-up of green financing in this country? And if we see the success story of other countries who have really pushed for green finance, what is your view?
Okay. Well, thank you for your question, Nick. Yes, in terms of increasing take-up, I think we do need a two-pronged approach. One is to increasing the supply, and second is to build the demand and do it both ways at the same time, a two-pronged approach. In terms of increasing the supply, that's from the financial institutions, the financial markets, the ability of green financing. We have green bonds, we have sustainable bonds, green sukuk, but in this case, where bonds comes into play, it's only applicable to those who can afford it because the minimum size is 250 million ringgit. So we have to make green financing available to all players, to the small and medium enterprises across all sectors. And this is where I think banks can play a role. We have seen many countries, and I think also CIMB about 2 years ago has started to increase to put that into their DNA, sustainability in their DNA. And what does it mean is that if it means also that they might shift from a certain percentage to a higher percentage of loan portfolio of green loans. So these green loans can then be more attractive to the marketplace if it's cheaper, if there's a reduction of basis points of 5 to 20 basis points. So then the private sector says, okay, it's cheaper now if I take a loan for the consumers, if I buy a hybrid car, if I buy a property that is certified as green, or if I want to retrofit my building to have more energy efficiency, I can take a loan and it's cheaper. To the industries, to the sectors, then it's also very attractive across agriculture, manufacturing, transportation sector. So if I need to buy a compressor to reduce my energy costs, right, and it costs X number to retrofit the building and the machinery, I can then take a cheaper loan. So here in this case is then for banks to say, if sustainability and green economy, and they believe in that, then it's a serious look where we can see banks in the OECD countries are now shifting, and they're also saying, I will stop to lend to fossil fuel projects. This is an area that Malaysian banks can start to look at it. This is really a good way to go. Also, in terms of financing, the government can play a role in terms of tax incentives, tax holiday allowances, grants to create more green jobs in this case. So it requires, again, a whole sectoral approach. It requires regulators to advocate and build awareness in the marketplace. It also requires Bank Negara role, Bursa's role in this place, and it's also probably a thing that is not about maximizing shareholder returns, but it's about optimizing returns. And that's in consideration with environmental, societal considerations. What it's about, do we maximize our profit, and at the same time we are polluting the environment? And that's where carbon pricing comes in. It's also a signal to the marketplace that it's a whole society approach where government, the private sector plays a part, and of course definitely the public.
Okay. My next question is to you, Syed. So following what Mei Ling mentioned in terms of the importance of having the right products to drive this activity, from your point of view, what do you think about the availability of green financing products in the banking industry? I mean, is it sufficient, or is it more that can be done? What do you think?
Well, I think that more can be done for this, because just to share with you our experience when we started with the GTFS, which is a loan guarantee scheme guaranteed by the government, providing finance for any banks that provide finance. But in the initial years when we started this in 2010, we had a lot of challenges. The green technology projects were perceived as high risk by the banks due to the unfamiliarity and limited track record, which had led to, of course, higher due diligence costs. And then it mostly involved novel technologies, and that businesses models lack pertinent information for the banks to access. And as a result, the banks also impose stringent criteria leading to higher cost of financing. And there were also scarce dedicated green lending facilities. And as banks, of course, would prefer to stick to the traditional lending sectors which they are very familiar with. So in our quest to increase the uptake of GTFS, what we did was we had done various promotional efforts through road shows, project pitching sessions with banks, seminars, workshops. We even conduct training programs for the banks as well as the project developers in order to increase the take-up rate of that scheme. And we see in 2012, there was a spike of increase in the take-up rate because of the emergence of the feed-in tariff mechanism. And as a result, 85% of the recipient of the scheme are made up from the energy sector, mainly on the renewable energy sector. So when the scheme ended, we thought that the government should come up with more de-risking as well as credit enhancement schemes or instruments in order to scale up more green investments into the economy. So this is one of the things that that we have experienced. So of of course, awareness is one thing, but the other thing is that bank must be equipped to have the technical knowledge of familiar with the green technology and also low carbon technologies. And we still conduct training programs. We are free to offer you any of the banks that are interested to join our training programs. A bit of marketing selling pitch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Syed. So Darshan, my next question to you is a bit different, because if we look at the various research that has been done by your institute, I mean, you not only cover climate change and economy, but you also look at, social issues, income inequality and the rest of it. And I think now, it's very clear on everyone's mind because, of the lockdown, we are affected economically, not just our country, but the rest of the world. Many people don't have the, I suppose, the latitude to basically pay a premium cost, for something green. It has to be something competitive. So just now, when Mei Ling talked about, green loans for car, for hybrid, for solar panels, I mean, we all know that hybrid cars in this country is not cheap. It's quite expensive. So I'm just trying to get your point of view in this. I mean, how do we balance in terms of achieving our long-term aspiration to reduce our carbon emission, whilst at the same time coming up with a appropriate policy to manage all the other economic issues as well, especially when it comes to affordability?
Yeah, that's quite a question. There are a lot of different aspects to unpack about this. But yeah, you're right. There are concerns that if we were to implement a price on carbon, that in general we'll see increases in prices. And I've done work in this regard. So in 2019 I drew up a policy for a carbon tax and rebate, which involved estimating exactly how much we would have to use of any carbon pricing mechanism to then cover the costs of living increases for low-income households. And I focus specifically on the B40. And what I found is that using very generous figures for electricity consumption and cost pass-through from polluters to consumers, I found that to rebate low-income households or low-income individuals for electricity cost increases, it would cost 65 ringgit per year at a carbon price of 35 ringgit per ton, or 93 ringgit per year at a carbon price of 50 ringgit per ton. So when we extend this to then the transport sector as well, in total we're looking at rebates costing somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 billion ringgit per year in total to rebate all the B40 for cost of living increases. But compare that against carbon tax revenues of closer to 7 or 8 billion ringgit. So we're looking at it, with carbon pricing, it'll be very easy for us to generate the sort of revenue that can account for any cost of living increases faced by lower income households, and still leave more on top of that to drive funding for further climate change initiatives. And we're seeing across the world as well carbon revenue neutral carbon taxes. So and what this means is whatever revenues are taken in by a carbon tax, for example, in British Columbia and Canada, they have cut distortionary taxes. Like I think 50% of the revenues from British Columbia's carbon tax are used to cut corporate taxes. 25% are used to cut individual income taxes, and another 25% are used for direct cash transfers. So very holistic, all-encompassing carbon pricing schemes that take care of the environmental side, but also consider the socioeconomic consequences of carbon pricing. That's the way to go. And these policies can also be used to drive green financing. Just to add on to the conversation we were having just now, another potential big driver of investment in low carbon industries is the government. And we've had many policies over the years. We've had the net energy metering, feed-in tariff, the small renewable energy program, and yet today our share of electricity generation that comes from solar and the other so there's a long way to go, and I think that public financing for these initiatives is a huge factor in this regard, and carbon pricing can play a big role in unlocking that public financing.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so Julian, my question to you is, as an end user, no, we talk about, how there could be economic impact from carbon pricing, but if I ask your view, let's say that the government announced tomorrow that they're going to take up carbon pricing and going to implement a set of policy to make this happen. What would be your wish list in terms of how it should be implemented, or in terms of communication or transparency? Do you have any view on that?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and that's a very pertinent one. There actually has been some amount of like behavioral science, political science research as well about like the communication of carbon pricing policies. And for example, there are findings that if you communicate it as an offset versus communicating as a tax, there's a difference in receptivity. Generally, citizens, consumers have an aversion towards tax. So most of these studies have been conducted among U.S. consumers, where there generally is a skepticism about taxes to begin with. However, I think given like in Malaysia as well, with the experience of GST, where there was a lot of public resistance towards it, if it's communicated as a new tax, it's likely that it's going to trigger some public resistance, and also we might see it becoming then politicized and as a form of resisting the government as well. And so like how it's communicated as potentially an offset rather than as a tax, and also something that is and another thing that the literature talks about is as well is around like upstream versus downstream carbon pricing regulation. So is it making clear to consumers as well whether who is actually going to be bearing the burden, even if let's say the prices are passed down, but is it clear that it's the large emitters, the fossil fuel companies, the utility companies that are on which these regulations are going to be imposed? The largest carbon emitters are going to be then perceived by the public to be held accountable for their emissions. That can make something like carbon pricing more acceptable among the general public.
Thank you very much, Julian. Okay, so let's shift our discussion to what we've been talking a lot about cost and tax and the rest of it. Let's talk about opportunities and innovation. So Mei Ling, I do believe that ESG, or this transition to a low carbon economy, also present a lot of opportunities for countries that wish to take advantage into it. So from your point of view, what does it take for us to benefit or to exploit the opportunities that this present? Is it more innovation, or is it more investments from more FDI investments? What is your view?
Yes, thank you for your question. If I may, I also would like to go back to the question you posed to Julian earlier on better communications and the wish list by the youth also. I think one of the things that whether is tax or carbon pricing or cost or subsidies, I agree with Darshan, and that is a very politically charged. It's very it's difficult. It's also a populist policies. But the thing is that all of us here in this room, right, it's like preaching to the preacher here, right? All of us in this room share common values in terms of climate action, in terms of environment, a greener growth, and we say that we want to do whatever it takes to achieve those goals, right? And I give an example of UK. In the last year, in 2020, the first time ever, renewable energy has surpassed fossil fuels consumption, and the total energy mix is less than what it is in 1970. 2020 and 1970. And this is despite of doubling the GDP growth, increasing population. So you can actually go towards a low carbon economy or decarbonization, and you still have jobs, you still have a good life. And what this good life actually means, right? It's not just about money, right? And it is also all about, so that this tax, this carbon tax, right, and or fuel tax, all right, we have reintroduced back the fuel subsidies, and when it translates to most of us, the top 50%, is sometimes it's about 60 ringgit more to the car that I own, right? And if we think that the coal and gas, the electricity that we consume, the amount of air condition, do you know that between 1992 to 2012, the share of coal in our electricity mix has doubled, and natural gas has decreased? To the contrary, it's not increased. The gas has decreased, the coal has increased. So if we continue on this path, the trajectory is that we're going to have more and more coal in our electricity, right? If we consume more electricity. So the low-hanging fruit is not gas. The low-hanging fruit is boosting RE and boosting EE. And the EE production must be not just the government in large-scale solar farms, but it's also households, and it's also the business sector. Yeah, and this has to be nationwide. We have to incentivize the marketplace. The banks, the commercial banks, has to take that leadership. The private sector also has to take that leadership role, and every one of us needs to create that supply and that demand to the government, and everyone has that concept to that place. So in terms then going back to your question on innovations, so this is where the innovation comes in, right? It produces more jobs, greener jobs, and it's an opportunity for us to transition to upskill ourselves, reskill ourselves in all sectors. So Malaysia is trying to position itself as a green finance Islamic hub. It is good in certain sectors, and we want to look into 10 years ago, we have transformation program. It tries to boost into renewable energies, into green tech investments, GTFS. This is where I think that's where we can see the marketplace, which sectors we are doing well, and then insert green jobs in every sector. So yes, let's stop here.
Thank you very much. Syed, my next question to you is again about innovation. What do you think is the role of the startup community or entrepreneurial community towards creating more innovation? Because if you look at other countries, United States, for example, a lot of the new breakthrough actually came from the startup community. I mean, do you think that that is an important element as part of our overall strategy?
Well, Nick, I do think that is an important element, but from looks of things that it's not happening here. I guess the reason for that is lack of awareness, and like I said previously that whatever funds that we can tap from the tax as well as private sector, we can use this fund to accelerate all these technological innovations through R&D. And at the same time, we can provide seed funding for those entrepreneurs, particularly those startups, and in order for them to not only to do research, but also in order for them to come up with the pilot plan or pilot project, and then throughout the landscaping or the financing, they can go to the banks for financing. And I can see that the other thing is that DFIs also needs to play a big role here, because they are the ones that are supposed to develop the industry. Of course, we know different DFIs have different sectors that they are focusing in, but they can put the elements of low carbon, put elements of climate change into their programs in order to that they can finance more low carbon efficient projects. So yes, entrepreneur, we need them. We need the funding, and this is where I think that I am still an advocate that we need funds coming from taxes. Of course, that has such challenges that was mentioned. There are political challenges there, but then we do need this in order for us to scale up investments in green technology. And I give you an example, well, people perceive green technology as high cost. Well, I'm here in my office premises here. We call this office Green Energy Office, GEO building. an office of this size would normally, a building of this size, the electricity would normally be about 40,000 ringgit a month on full capacity. But we are paying only 10,000 a month, which is much, and so I'm sorry, not 10,000, 4,000 ringgit a month, which is about 10% of the conventional building like this. So it has all the green building features and all that, and we save a lot of our costs. We save a lot of energy. At the same time, we reduce carbon emission reduction. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. That innovation is there, very important, and of course, we need to support the entrepreneurs by providing the seed funding for them to go into the technological innovations of low carbon technologies.
Thank you very much, Syed. So Darshan, Encik Syed mentioned that he wishes to see more innovation in the startup community. So my question to you is, how do we create more innovation in this country, especially in the context of green technology? Is it all just investments? Is it just policy and awareness, or does it take more than that?
I think funding will naturally play a huge part in this, and I think that devoting funding towards low carbon industries, low carbon initiatives can definitely drive greater innovation and creative disruption in these industries. It's just all about creating the right signaling, and when we talk about this, it's not just a matter of driving more funding, but it also becomes a question of, are we grooming our next generation of potential innovators with the right skill sets to be able to take advantage of these opportunities? Like right now, there are plenty of opportunities to generate growth in renewables, in the electric vehicle industry, and there's a lot of R&D that's being done across the world in things like, let's say, even carbon capture and storage technologies. But Malaysia is not putting itself in the position to become amongst the chief value creators in these industries. Like, for example, we are one of the largest producers of solar panels in the world, the third largest producer after China and the EU, if I'm not mistaken, with a production capacity of about 3.3 gigawatts a year. But a lot of these companies that produce these panels are foreign owned. So they're taking advantage of the skill sets that the Malaysian workers have, and the fact that our labor is cheaper, but they're not these national champions. And a similar story, we can look at the biofuel industry, for example. Malaysia has abundant biofuel stocks because of its thriving palm oil industry. But we are perhaps not taking as much of an advantage of this as we could. So it's all about taking advantage of these opportunities, like I said, and putting in the ecosystem to support growth in these areas.
Thank you very much. Those are very interesting points. Thank you. Finally, to Julian. We're talking about innovation and startup, which people usually associate with a younger generation. So what does it take, do you think, to encourage more innovation in green technology?
Thank you, Nick, for the question. Okay, yeah, certainly, like prospect of working in startups and so on is exciting for many young people. And in terms of what does it take to generate more innovation in green technology, so I think investment is one thing, however, one input. However, it's not enough. I think there needs to be, as Darshan mentioned, there needs to be like skills uplift as well. So, for example, our Malaysian schools, our universities, especially public universities, are they teaching our students in a way to cultivate them to be innovative, to be entrepreneurial, and also for those who are going to be like working on technological innovation, do they have the technological skill set to be able to contribute to innovation? And I mean, Malaysia, we've been trying to push for people to go into STEM education for many years now, and we still see like the numbers of people in STEM education are still a bit low. So we need to understand as well why is that, despite all the efforts. How do we make it actually like a STEM career, STEM education path and a career attractive? Because, for example, showing, for example, the link between science and technology and innovation and value creation for society, for the economy, maybe that's not exactly coming across very clearly right now in schools. Perhaps students may just have the impression that science is hard, math is hard. You may have to memorize a lot of formulas or facts, but they don't see how it can actually contribute to like a really fulfilling career, and that creates a lot of value. And also maybe as well, then maybe some amount of like cultural shifts as well might be needed. At least when I was in school as well, like generally there was this expectation that you just follow a certain path, go one step after the next, just choose like a safe job, like and climb the corporate ladder or whatever it is. However, perhaps there may be some more encouragement of like risk taking, because innovation involves risk as well. You need to try something new that haven't been tried before, and also that involves as well helping people learning about things like the concepts of like minimum viable product, where you can produce a product that's cheap and produce a prototype that's cheap and workable, and test it out to see that's effective and whether it works, get feedback, and then iterate and so on and so forth. So I think there are a number of inputs that are needed. So investments, skills uplift, science and technology education, and also probably some amount of cultural shift as well to encourage entrepreneurship, risk-taking, innovation.
Thank you very much, Julian. That is a fantastic point of view. And so I think we are getting to the end of this session. We have 4 minutes left. And, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for sharing your point of view. I've definitely learned a lot. And I'm sure, the rest of the listeners watching this also, have acquired a lot of new point of view on this topic. So before we end this, can I ask each of you to provide a 1-minute summary on what we have discussed during the last 1 hour, 15 minutes, starting with you, Mei Ling?
Thank you, Nick. 1-minute summary. Well, let's just go ahead and do it. Yes, I just also there's been a lot of chats and a lot of good questions that's there. I think in terms of implementing carbon pricing and also green financing, definitely it's definitely a good thing for the marketplace. Having a thoughtful phased approach is definitely parts. I think the government has always been mindful on implementing taxes or rationalizing subsidies, where the B20, B40 has always been structured, the pricing structure mechanism has always been taken care of. So when designed right, it will be good for the marketplace, for the economy. It will help Malaysia to become more competitive. Malaysia has, luckily, where it's not a road less traveled, more countries has traveled this road, and there's other lessons and success stories to learn from. So I think for Malaysia to take heart that this carbon pricing, green financing journey is for the better.
Thank you very much. Syed?
Well, to sum it up, in order to scale up investments in low carbon technology, we should consider carbon pricing as a very important option because of the carbon revenue that can be derived, that can be utilized to establish R&D funds to accelerate low carbon technological innovations, and introduce green fund to support the startups and venture capital funding, as well as financing for SMEs that are involved in green projects and production of green products and services. And I mentioned also the DFIs can play a very important role in scaling up low carbon investments, utilizing these public funds to attract and crowd in private investments. And secondly, we mentioned about the introducing of more de-risking and credit enhancement instruments, so as to get the banks to come on board in financing low carbon technology projects, thus the leveraging on the private sector funds, as well as in the introduction of other fiscal incentives for low carbon growth. That's all from me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Datin?
Okay. Well, as a summary, just one point: we have to implement some form of carbon pricing. But I wanted to leave with a thought, and that is this: accepting climate change and the need to act on climate change is acceptance that our way of life that we've gotten used to as a civilization has to change. And in our day-to-day actions, there's nothing that forces us to recognize how our actions are contributing to the issue of climate change. I've been sitting here listening and talking about climate change for the past 1.5 hours, and I've been sitting in an air-conditioned room the entire time, for example. So engendering behavioral shifts at the individual level is very difficult. And it's even more difficult when we're trying to do them through targets for renewable energies or all these command and control policy tools. And this is where carbon pricing does a better job.
Thank you very much.
Applied to economic activities. It impacts the decisions of individuals at the household level, and it ensures that way that climate change mitigation is not just only a top-down process, but a bottom-up process as well. So that's sort of the final point that I wanted to leave with.
Great, thank you very much. And Julian?
So yeah, so like to summarize, carbon pricing works, and it can be very effective in helping to generate this shift and transition to a low carbon economy, to a low carbon society. I do agree that Malaysia should do it. Let's also learn from other countries because it has been done elsewhere before. Let's learn what worked. Let's not repeat others' mistakes, and let's also adapt the policies to Malaysian context, and also ensure that whatever carbon price policy that's implemented is fair. The consequences, the gains, the benefits are distributed fairly and equitably across society. And also let's use the revenue to create new opportunities for society, create new value by investing and creating new green jobs that are fulfilling for people, including for young generations, and also help them to be by upskilling them and get ready for these new green jobs. And also to ensure that there's an all-of-society approach, so different stakeholders are included in the conversations, in the process, in policy consultations, for example, and including the youth in conversations like this roundtable. And so we are very grateful that we were invited, and we hope to continue to be included in such conversations going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. So that concludes our session today. 1.5 hours just flew by so quickly. I just want to thank you again, Mei Ling. Thank you so much for your point of view, Syed, Darshan, Julian. Really enjoyed talking to you, and I do feel personally that we need to do a second round of this. Because this issue is not simple. There is a lot of complex consideration that we need to explore further. But you've definitely opened my mind about that topic. So with that, I end this session. Thank you very much to all the listeners for listening to us. Feel free to follow any of the speakers or LinkedIn or any other mode of social media. So with that, I end the session. Thank you very much, and you all have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.